My number 8 best chess game of the 1990s is Garry Kasparov versus Vladimir Kramnik from Dos Hermanos in 1996. Now, throughout the 1990s, these two played many incredible and sharp battles, of which this one is probably the sharpest, and Kasparov often cited Kramnik as a very valid potential successor to his throne. Ultimately, we would not get that showdown in the 1990s, but just afterwards, in 2000, when they played a world championship match. Kasparov opened this game with pawn to d4. He could not have possibly known it when he played this move, but this was in fact going to be his first loss since 1986 with this move, that is over 10 years previous. After d4, we get d5. We're just going to make a few large strategic points about the opening, which is extremely theoretical, well studied by both players. After bishop d3, the exchange on c4 leads to a Meran Semi-Slav, a really exciting, rich, sharp, strategic struggle. Here, the move pawn b5 pushes the bishop back, and after it falls back, the struggle really revolves around this push pawn to c5 from black. Black is hoping to achieve this push, and in doing so, attack the white center and also free up the bishops. If black does it in a good way, then black gets an excellent game. On the other hand, white is first of all hoping to stop this expansion with pawn to c5, although that really shouldn't be achievable if black plays well. And second of all, to develop some initiative if black should succeed with pawn to c5. If white gets a good initiative, then the opening works out well for the white player. Now, after bishop d3, we get bishop b7. Castles, a6, you need to support this pawn or at least take the pressure off of it before you break with c5. Now white expands in the middle of the board and c5 happens. d5. So both players have kind of achieved what they wanted. We get c5 from black, but we do get d5 from white, and the center is breaking down a little bit, so white is getting some of that initiative. After this, we get pawn to c4, tapping that bishop right here. It falls back to c2, and then we get queen c7, knight to d4. This is actually the sort of new idea that Kasparov is bringing to the table. This is a relatively uncommon move, so Kasparov had definitely prepared it for this game. After knight d4, we see increased pressure here on that pawn on e6, and knight c5 from Kramnik both defends it and attacks this pawn on e4, so a multi-purpose move. One of the great things about this game is that you're seeing thrust and counter thrust. Both players are bringing really interesting ideas at all times, and the tightrope that both players have to walk is really very narrow. Either player could have won this game spectacularly. Pawn to b4. Kasparov's idea is to destabilize this knight and open lines. Of course, you can't just fall back with that knight. The game would collapse, so you must capture en passant. After a takes, we do see that white has achieved some opening of lines, and now the idea of b4 is back on the table, so black expands with b4, stopping it physically. This also attacks this knight, which is supporting e4. It pushes it to the a4 square. Now, the situation here is that this pawn is now vulnerable, but at the same time, the knight that supports e6 is also vulnerable. So both players are dealing with vulnerable central pawns. Kramnik follows through and captures on e4, but that does leave this vulnerable, and after a capture here on e4, Kasparov does take on e6. At this point, it looks like the position might collapse very, very soon for black. The king is still in the middle of the board, and it needs to at least develop this bishop before it can get castled or get to some measure of safety. That's why, in this position, Kramnik goes ahead and plays bishop to d6. This move is really already anticipating a piece sacrifice in order to get castled and also to put pressure on the white king. After bishop d6, there's obvious pressure down here on h2, and next move, we would castle with black if we could. In this position, we do see Kasparov capture here on f7, and an excellent move from Kramnik. Queen takes f7. This is fully committing to the piece sacrifice that we're going to see. There's not going to be time for black to castle without sacrificing a piece. After queen takes f7, The point is f3. And if in this position or in the position on the next move, you simply pull this knight back with something like knight c5, then rook e1 check would be really strong, or even other ideas exist like knight to f5, opening up an attack on d6. The black king is getting caught with his pants down in the middle of the board, and it is a disaster for Kramnik in this position. So, after f3, the point is not to move this knight, not to save this knight. It's going to stay here, and black is going to use that time to make threats against the white king. Queen to h5, an immediate threat here on h2. Because of that threat, you cannot at this point capture the knight. If you do, after queen takes, the king is forced to f2, not a very good position. And castles, check, an excellent move. You just have to love any time that you can castle with check. In this case, this would be totally decisive. The king is forced over, and this move is tremendous. It's putting pressure on this. It's putting pressure here. After maybe a trade of rooks, bishop f4 is also a threat. The position cannot be held, and the white king is dead in the water on e3. So, backing up. After f3, queen h5, you can't take the knight yet. But after pawn to g3, you are threatening to take it on this move. And again, the knight cannot retreat because of all kinds of danger affecting the king here in the middle of the board. Therefore, it's time to sacrifice a piece, but how do you do it? In fact, Kramnik did make the wrong decision here. Analysis of this really sharp position shows that the strongest way to sacrifice the piece was the most direct way, simply knight takes g3 right here. After knight takes, h takes, you got to get the king out of here, so it's a good time to castle, and there's still threats in this position. You're all over the king side here, but white can hold the balance with rook to a2. In this position, there's a number of interesting ideas. For example, rook to d8. The most direct move, bishop takes g3, also maintains a good position, but rook to g2 can hold on. Very unclear chances for both sides. An attacking player is definitely going to want to play the black pieces. Maybe a greedy player would rather have the white pieces. But this was the way to play, objectively speaking. Instead, though, after pawn to g3, the method that Kramnik chose to sacrifice the piece was castles. Now, this is really tempting. I love seeing a player castle as part of an attack. This is exciting, but there is a refutation hidden here. After castles, you do need to accept this knight. Otherwise, you have nothing as white, and black has a tremendous initiative. So the knight is captured here. F takes e4, and now queen h3. Coming in here, threatening bishop takes g3, bishop takes e4, putting pressure on f1, generally creating a ton of threats against this white king. However, in this position, there is a defense. That is queen to e2. This is not only successfully defending, it's even winning with best play. After queen to e2, bishop takes g3 looks really, really dangerous. You cannot take this bishop because after h takes, queen takes g3 check. Queen blocks. Then you can trade here on f1. The king is forced to capture because the queen is pinned. Check. And you need to defend the queen, so you go to g1 and then queen e1 check, king h2, rook f2, pins and wins the queen. White had no way to avoid that in that critical line. But after the bishop sacrifice on g3, strong here is knight to f5. And both Kasparov and Kramnik missed this really excellent move. It looks like there should be something available for black, but there actually really isn't. For example, in this position, after rook takes f5, which looks very, very dangerous, it is possible simply to play rook takes f5. And bishop takes h2 check looks dangerous. There's other dangerous lines too. But after, for example, queen g4 check and picking up e4 when there's a lot of loose white pieces, you can slide in with queen to e5. This is a tremendous centralized queen, a bit of a wooden shield, to be entirely honest. And in this position, it looks like there should be something available to attack this white king. But honestly, there really isn't any way to get at that king. It's actually quite safe. The dominant white queen in the middle of the board holds everything, and white should win the game. There's a number of other lines. This game is super sharp. I'm not going to get into all of the lines, all of the potential analysis that you could dive into, but after queen to h3, queen to e2, followed by knight f5, was a successful defense. It could have won the game for Kasparov. Instead, he played the move knight to f3, stepping back here. After knight to f3, still bishop takes g3. In this position, there's one more defense available. Not a winning one, but a defense that would have held the balance. That is queen to e2, holding e4, holding h2. Now, after queen to e2, strong as rook takes f3, but it's not enough to win the game. After rook takes f3, you definitely can't take with the queen because of mate. That's pretty straightforward. Neither player is going to allow that. And after rook takes, you can take here on h2. Now, the bishop can be captured, or you can run with the king here, but black has enough counterplay for at least a perpetual as the king is under fire. There's a lot of lines here, but objectively, black has enough counterplay. If the queen had captured instead here, then the rook falls on f3, and white can play here queen g2 and try to hold on, but this seems maybe a little worse. You've given back some material, whereas in the other line when the king is running, you've not given back some material to the opponent. Still, that was critical. Last chance for queen to e2. Instead, knight c5 was played by Kasparov. He actually had this move kind of prepared and was relying on this move to hold the balance, but he either missed or underestimated a move in the ensuing complications. In this position, rook takes f3. Boom. Beautiful move. Now, first off, you have to have an escape square for your king, so queen takes h2, mate, off the table. So we get rook takes f3, which leaves a little room for the king to run, but after rook takes f3, queen takes h2, king f1, bishop c6. Now, actually, Kramnik said of this move, quote, a quiet move of crushing strength, which was underestimated or overlooked by Kasparov. After the light square bishop joins the attack, the position of white's king becomes totally precarious. So this is the critical move. Kramnik even gives it 2 exclamation marks in his notes. The introduction of the bishop on b5 is a winning idea. There's no defense for white. My favorite defensive try is rook to a5, hoping to sacrifice your rook for the bishop. But then I like bishop c7, just saying to that rook, how are you going to stay there and sacrifice yourself for the bishop? This is a win for black. Unfortunately, though, for Kasparov, everything is a win for black at this point. So bishop c6, bishop g5, bishop to b5 check, and now knight to d3, blocking that bishop. Obviously, there's a ton of pressure, though, on this knight. The fact that Kasparov is up a rook is not going to save him. Rook to e8, I really like this attacking move. There are other nice moves, but I love to introduce that final piece that wasn't participating into the attack. The idea of just taking on e4 is overwhelming. After rook to e8, a good try from Kasparov, that is rook to a2, attacking the queen over here and introducing the piece that's not participating in defense, although maybe also this piece is not participating in defense, into some kind of second rank attempted hold. After rook to a2, queen takes, and then rook takes g3 is the point. Actually here, reversing again and going back to the exact opposite side of the board with queen h2 is winning according to the engine, but there's another available line. Kramnik did not have to go for this. I do like the idea of swinging the rook or the queen all the way to a2 and then back to h2, though. It's a very, very funny back and forth. So after rook to a2, very, very famously here, Kramnik missed a forced checkmate in 4. Now, he found a winning line, so it's a little bit pointless, but come on. We all want to try and find the missed forced mate in 4 that Kramnik could have played here. Definitely pause your video and see if you can calculate it. Well, if you found bishop takes d3 check, then in this moment, the small moment, you outperformed Kramnik. After bishop takes d3 check, there's simply no way to defend. Bishop takes d3 and queen takes d3 runs into mate on e1 right over here. And after bishop takes d3, rook takes d3 instead. Sorry, misclick right there. Rook takes d3, queen to h1 check. The point is that e4 is going to fall with mate. Throw this check in, and then boom, and checkmate. Forced. Nothing that Kasparov could have done to avoid that. Actually, according to Kramnik in his notes about this game, he said, having seen a forced win, I did not even bother to look for anything better, especially since I had a little time left. Meanwhile, it would have been simpler to conclude the game with the forced mate, and he gives the forced mate. And he says, it may seem incredible that this was not seen by a player with such a rating, but the explanation is probably that it is psychologically difficult to give up such a bishop for such a knight. And so at a particular moment, this move may simply be overlooked. And I think that's a really brilliant point. A strong player instinctively never wants to give up this amazing bishop that's pinning this immobile knight here, but tactics do overrule strategy. So in this case, this would have worked. Not essential though, because the move played, queen h1 check, is enough to win the game as well. This move is going to pick up this rook after picking up e4 with check. So rook takes e4, king to d2, you skewer back here, and you pick up the rook. A moment ago, you could have done this, and then rook takes g3 was possible. Now it's still possible, but it's immediately losing. Queen a1 check, pushes the king up, queen check here, and then simply rook to d4. In this position, there's no way to save the knight. When the knight goes, then the piece equality is restored. Both players will have a rook, queen, and a bishop, but there's still 3 extra pawns that will exist on the board for Kramnik, and he will also have the safer king. Therefore, in this position, Kasparov did choose to resign and concede the game. This is a really beautiful game, and it is typical of a few wonderful victories by Kramnik in this decade against Kasparov that really kind of put a lot of pressure on him, put him in the spotlight as people started anticipating his exciting challenge to Kasparov for the World Chess Championship crown. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. If so, please do check out the playlist with the other best games of the 1990s or the best games of the 2000s. It's sitting right on top of your screen.